the drive, the vision, the thirst for power. What turned Adolf Hitler from an insignificant loser to the most powerful and feared man in Europe? In this film, we speak to forensic psychologists.
At this point, Hitler is no different to many contestants that you'll see on talent shows.
To leading historians.
If there's one day that shook Hitler, this was that day.
And we scour the archives for accounts from his peers, which will illuminate his inner world. We'll get under Hitler's skin to reveal the 7 momentous days that made the Führer. On the 2nd of October, 1907, Hitler received the first major rejection of his life when his application to Art Academy was turned down. This single act triggered a terrifying chain of events. To understand its significance, we have to go back further in time. In April 1889, Clara Hitler gave birth to Adolf in this house in Braunau, Austria. The town sits on the River Inn, which forms part of the Austro-German border. Adolf's early life was marred by catastrophe. 4 of his siblings died at a very young age. This inevitably affected how his mother treated him at a crucial point in his psychological development.
His mother must have been absolutely terrified that something could happen to him at any given moment, and so she doted on him. She met his needs, she waited on him hand and foot, but that would have interfered with his personality development. It sent the message to him that he was special, perhaps even the chosen one, the one chosen to survive. But he wouldn't have known why or how that should be manifest, which would have predisposed him to being narcissistic. What tends to happen is that narcissistic children are very passive and they retreat into a fantasy life. And that fantasy life is very much involved with them creating identities for themselves that are grandiose.
This is exactly what Hitler did. He believed that he had the talent to become one of the world's greatest artists. This wasn't just important, this was everything to him. He was encouraged by his doting mother. But his father Alois demanded that his son become a civil servant. It caused enormous tension in the Hitler household, and his father flogged him frequently. They carried on fighting until over his morning glass of wine, Alois dropped dead.
Hitler was quite relieved when his father died. He said after he came back from the funeral, "I'm free now of my father's tyranny." So in a way, oddly enough, one of the most tyrannical figures in history was trying to escape, first of all, the tyranny of his own father.
Now there was nobody to stop Hitler becoming a great artist. He moved to Vienna, Austria's seat of art and culture. He applied to the prestigious Art Academy, assuming his acceptance would be a formality. A portfolio of Hitler's sketches from around this time still exists. It gives a valuable insight into the quality of work he would have submitted to the Academy. The direction the young Adolf's life would take all hung on how his work was judged.
This one with the candlestick is a particular style that I like to call smudge and rub. It's very dull, and there's maybe 2.5 tones here, so it looks particularly flat. For something to be three-dimensional, you need at least 3 tones. This landscape, again, very flat, very two-dimensional, very limited use of shading or tone. And it's with the human beings that he seemed to have the most trouble with and seemed to look the most mannequin-like or most plastic with. Hands are very badly painted. Hands are extremely difficult to paint. So if we had to sort of relate it to a standard today, probably GCSE, C level, nothing outstanding. He was never going to be a great artist.
Back in 1907, that was the Academy's view too. Hitler's application to the Academy was rejected. His destiny had been denied him. He exploded with absolute rage. Not at his own inadequacies, but at the people who had thwarted him. Hitler's flatmate, August Kubizek, later wrote how he ranted about the Academy's examiners.
He told me they were old-fashioned, fossilized civil servants, bureaucrats devoid of understanding, and that the Academy should be blown up.
Hitler is no different to many contestants that you'll probably see on talent shows. People who are absolutely convinced of their own talent and ability. And when that is questioned, you can see the shock on their face. And you can see how they reframe what has just happened and start to point the finger at the people who've been judging them. And that's precisely what Hitler did.
Just weeks after his rejection from Art Academy had dealt him a crushing blow, his mother died from cancer. The doctor that treated her was struck by Adolf's reaction, saying,
"In all my career, I had never seen anyone so prostrate with grief."
Hitler had suffered 2 devastating events in quick succession. His life was thrown into chaos. He became one of many down and outs in Vienna, scraping together whatever living he could by selling his paintings to tourists. He became paralysed by self-pity.
He didn't really put much effort into changing his circumstances, even though he could have done if he wanted to apply himself. Now, that kind of lifestyle is very much what we see with psychopaths. So that, to me, is the first indication of psychopathy in Hitler.
He may have swilled about with the dregs of society in Vienna, but his sense of superiority never left him.
He still has this kind of idea that in some way he's special, but he doesn't really know what he's special for yet.
Hitler remained directionless until global events brought salvation. On the 10th of November 1918, Hitler found out that the First World War was over. Germany was about to capitulate, and his world collapsed for a second time. His journey to this momentous day began 4 years earlier at the outbreak of war, when he rushed headlong into joining the German army. Private Hitler was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment.
The army gave Hitler what had been so badly lacking in the last few years of his life. It gave him a surrogate family, so all of his practical needs could be met. So he didn't have to think for himself, he could just throw himself into the army lifestyle. It also gave him a sense of identity and purpose.
Hitler was a dispatch runner, taking messages from command to the front lines. He saw action many times on the Western Front, including the Somme and Ypres. Yet despite horrific conditions, Hitler felt at home. his commander commented,
"There was no circumstance or situation that would have prevented him from volunteering for the most difficult, arduous, and dangerous tasks."
Hitler was twice awarded the Iron Cross before a mustard gas attack left him temporarily blinded. He was recovering in hospital when he heard the devastating news that was to change his life. Germany had capitulated and lost the war. The Allies were celebrating victory, but the armistice struck Hitler like a bolt from the blue.
The German army leadership didn't tell the people that they were losing. The propaganda kept on pumping out stories of victory. So when it came to announcing the loss of the war under unfavourable circumstances, this came as an enormous shock to the great majority of Germans.
None more so than Hitler. The army had become a way of life. Now, with the war over, he risked losing his new family. Once again, he went into meltdown. He later wrote in Mein Kampf,
"Since the day I stood at my mother's grave, I had not wept. But now I could not help it."
For the second time in Hitler's life, everything had collapsed about his ears, and everything that he held dear was being threatened and also insulted, because that's how he would have taken Germany's defeat.
Throughout the First World War, his delusions of grandeur were kept in check. Now, in the depths of his abject despair, they once again came to the fore.
The extraordinary element of his pre-war days, the sense of genius, the sense of artist, the sense of specialness, is transformed into his personal sense that he is called by history, by fate, to do something personally about this, to put this situation right.
Hitler would later say that he had a vision, that it was now his destiny to lead Germany back to greatness. This was his life's new purpose, but the narcissist in him meant that there still had to be somebody to blame for his life not going to plan.
First of all, it was his father. Then it was these fossilised bureaucrats in the Vienna School of Art. And now it's the Jews.
Like other people, Hitler wrongly blamed Germany's tiny Jewish minority for turning against the army at the end of the war. While others pointed the finger of blame, he was already plotting revenge. This would consume him for the rest of his life. But what he needed to fulfill his destiny was to get other people behind him. On the 12th of September 1919, Hitler gave his first political address. He discovered a natural talent for public speaking that was to turn him into a charismatic leader. As the German army demobilized after the armistice, Hitler faced the stark possibility of returning to a life as it was in Vienna before the war. He was desperate to stay in the army with his surrogate family, and he managed to cling on. There was an atmosphere of revolution all over Germany at this time, and Hitler was charged with spying on the new political parties springing up in Munich to make sure they weren't a political threat. One night, Hitler was ordered to go to this beer hall and infiltrate a meeting of the German Workers' Party, who were also known as the DAP. This was the night he entered politics. This was the night his meteoric rise to power began.
Hitler went to the meeting, duly observed the proceedings, which he thought were fairly pathetic. And at the end, he got up and delivered a rant to the meeting, which bowled a lot of people over.
In his element, Hitler railed against the Jews, blaming them for Germany's humiliating defeat. He realised his views were exactly the same as the party's, but he could express them better. This was like music to the ears of the DAP members.
His first meeting with the DAP is like the reversal of the rejection from the academy. Here he goes into a room with a few extremists in the back room of a pub, and suddenly he's more than admitted, he immediately rises to being the most important personality of this group.
Adoration, recognition, these are things that are really like oxygen to a narcissist. So here we have Hitler, finally, after all of these years, being recognised for the brilliant person that he always suspected that he was. So here's a point at which he is not at the mercy of other people and other forces. And I really think that it would have fuelled his idea that actually, yes, I can control what happens on a wide scale.
Just 1 week after spying on the DAP meeting, he joined the party. 6 months later, he resigned from the army, leaving his first surrogate family behind. He became a full-time politician and took his first steps to fulfilling his destiny, becoming leader of Germany. His public speaking was a skill that over the coming years would become the key to his success. He took it from an embryonic form in 1919 to devastating heights by the 1930s.
He starts off typically with 30 seconds, maybe as long as 2 minutes of silence to pull the audience in, to heighten their sense of anticipation. The beginning of the speech will be slow, formal, quite restrained. He will then gradually crank up and build up the power through the speech, and the pitch of his voice changes and the whole speed and style raises. His natural dialect was South Bavarian, a kind of country yokel style, if you like, very slow. But in his speaking, he adopted a much more formal Hochdeutsch, North German, for his speeches. The interesting thing is that when he was being most emotive, he would then slip back into his South Bavarian accent, and that would be where the emotions really came through.
Dann werden wir wieder emporsteigen, genau wie die Väter einst auch Deutschland nicht geschenkt erhielten, sondern selbst schaffen mussten.
What we all associate with the Hitler speech is the idea of the tirade, the rant. This is absolutely intended.
Wenn wir in der Partei durch unser aller Zutun die höchste Verkörperung des nationalsozialistischen Gedankens und Wesens verwirklichen.
It's not Hitler himself who was quite restrained as a person, but he used this tirade device to heighten the emotions of his audience.
Dann wird einst neben die herrliche, ruhmreiche Armee den alten, stolzen Waffenträgern unseres Volkes
The idea is that he was so overtaken by the message that rather like a preacher, it all comes pouring forth, as though he's not really speaking at all. It's almost the power of tongues that he's giving out this divine message.
Wir können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos uns gehört.
His style would have been dramatically different to anything else that was going on in the German political life at that time. German political thinking would be all about reason and putting forth a reasoned argument, explaining things. Hitler understood there was nothing to do with logic, nothing to do with reason. It was all about grabbing people's emotions.
Wenn die älteren Jahrgänge noch wanken werden könnten, die Jugend ist uns verschrieben und verfallen mit Leibesbetäten.
It's absolutely manipulative, and it's brilliantly successful, and it was turned to devastating and terrible consequences. He was probably the first, and still maybe the only politician who really understood that it's nothing to do with the op-ed pieces in the papers. It's about persuading masses of people that you are right, and you're the only person that's going to be right.
Es lebe Deutschland!
Back when Hitler first became a politician, his natural talent for speaking swiftly propelled him up through the ranks of the DAP. 2 years after joining, he'd climbed to the top of what was now called the National Socialist Workers' Party, otherwise known as the Nazis. But being leader of the party wasn't enough. Driven by his own delusions, he risked everything he'd gained by trying to overthrow the German government. On the 8th of November 1923, Hitler tried to win ultimate power by force. Germany was under a state of emergency, following a period of political unrest and economic turmoil, including hyperinflation, where bundles of banknotes were more useful as children's building blocks than as cash.
Germany is in tremendous chaos at this particular time, and so Hitler thinks now is the moment for this coup.
His plan was to overthrow the local government in Munich and then march on Berlin to take over the whole of Germany. He knew the backing of both the people and the army were crucial to his success. He believed he would get both once the revolution began.
This day really illustrates just how fantastical Hitler was and how his thinking was way divorced from reality. He's not considered the consequences to himself if it all falls apart, because he thinks that it can't possibly go wrong.
The coup began at this beer hall on the evening of the 8th of November 1923. Some of Munich's politicians were holding a meeting here when hundreds of Hitler's paramilitary stormtroopers surrounded the building. Inside, Hitler jumped up on a chair and fired a shot into the ceiling. He then took 3 Bavarian government leaders hostage and tried to persuade them to join his revolution at gunpoint.
Because they're trapped with a guy with a gun, they say, of course we're going to support it. And Hitler doesn't take them prisoner, he lets them go.
That was his big mistake. Once free, they immediately withdrew their support for the coup. Soon after, it became clear that neither the army nor the police were going to back the revolution. The next day, Hitler, with his stormtroopers, marched on the War Ministry. It was his last-ditch attempt to spark a popular uprising. The police opened fire, and 14 Nazis were killed. Hitler himself nearly died when the person standing next to him was shot dead.
Hitler dislocates his shoulder and he's taken to a friend's house, and he realises that his first attempt to overthrow Germany by force has failed.
2 days later, he was arrested and charged with high treason.
Because he had this belief almost in the magic nature of reality, that if he had enough will, the forces of providence, the forces of destiny would somehow make reality open up in front of him, like the Red Sea dividing. He completely misread the forces of nationalism at work in Germany in 1923.
With Hitler in jail and the Nazi Party banned, the reality that his political career was probably over hit him hard. It had the same effect as the Art Academy rejection and the end of World War I. This third devastating blow provoked a typically extreme reaction.
Hitler considered suicide after the failed coup, and that's because to him his failure was such an insult, it was such an injury to his ego that he couldn't contemplate living anymore. And that's very, very typical of somebody who is totally enmeshed in a fantasy identity.
Yet this wasn't the end for Hitler. Once again, he managed to turn this personal catastrophe around. By the time he was sent to trial, he decided to take on his own defence. For most, this would be a reckless course of action. But for Hitler, the orator, it paid off.
The right-wing judge basically gives Hitler the floor to give daily speeches on nationalism. And these speeches get printed throughout the German press, and now Hitler, although he's been a small-town agitator, now becomes a national celebrity.
He was found guilty of high treason, a crime that carried the death penalty. But the judges were so taken by him that they handed him a lenient sentence. He got 5 years, to be served here in Landsberg prison. But he didn't exactly do hard time.
He's allowed to have people coming and going. He has, sort of sherry parties and wine parties inside the prison itself. He's treated really with kid gloves.
Amongst all the socialising, Hitler wrote a book, dictating much of it to Rudolf Hess, who was also serving time for his part in the failed coup. It was a consolidation of his political thinking, an ideology that had been forming since the end of World War I. It set out his conviction that Germany could only ever be great if every Jew was removed from German soil, by any means necessary. It was a book that would change history. It was My Struggle, Mein Kampf.
Adolf Hitler is basically given what is a sabbatical to write a book that's going to overthrow the German state and cause the Second World War and the Holocaust.
For all of Hitler's talent at speaking, it didn't translate onto the page.
It's a rambling, indigestible, overlong, incoherent tract with a few bits of really interesting, illuminating considerations, particularly on propaganda and how to win the masses over, how to speak to them and how to get them to support you.
Along with writing his book, the quiet of the prison cell gave Hitler the opportunity to learn from his mistakes, that his destiny would never be fulfilled by the bullet, but through the ballot box. The failure of the coup and his prison sentence should have spelt the end for Hitler. Instead, they gave him a renewed purpose. After being jailed for just over a year, Hitler was released for good behaviour. While inside, the Nazi Party had splintered. But once free, Hitler immediately re-established his leadership over the group. he set about getting power by democratic means. To start with, Hitler and the Nazis were only ever viewed as on the lunatic fringe. But all that changed 5 years later. On the 29th of October 1929, Wall Street collapsed. The fallout from this presented Hitler with his second chance to take power. This time, he wasn't going to get it wrong. When Hitler was released from prison, Germany had started dragging itself out of economic turmoil. The vast majority of people weren't interested in his radical nationalist views.
Everybody has forgotten about the Nazi Party. Hitler is yesterday's man. Nobody remotely thinks his idea that he'll come to power will come to fruition.
Germany's recovery was an illusion, though. Across the Atlantic, trouble was brewing. In America, speculative buying and selling of shares had rocketed. Stocks had become vastly overvalued. This bubble had to burst. And when it did, the US stock market went into freefall. It was the start of the first truly global economic crash.
Because it is the first example of this, politicians, economists are not prepared for it. They do not have the instruments to deal with it. They don't have the theories, the understanding and the knowledge to deal with it. And of course, they don't have the solutions to help get over it.
This crisis sent shockwaves around the world, and Germany was one of the countries hardest hit. As it plunged into a deep depression, there was a run on the banks, and the factories closed their gates.
6 million of the insured workers were made unemployed. When you think about it, at this time, one breadwinner and 3 or 4 children and a wife, that would affect 30 million people in Germany.
This disaster needed somebody to come up with a solution, but mainstream politicians had none. During the good times, Hitler's radical message fell on deaf ears, but now, people wanted something different. It was the perfect time to make his second play for power. To get the people behind him, he held rallies where thousands would attend. His anti-Semitism was cynically toned down to attract more of the electorate. But the underlying belief was still the same. Germany had to eradicate its inner enemies, the Jews.
Hitler seems to have been able to become normal, if you like, within the context of the social crisis that Germany was in.
In such dire times, the message began hitting home. People started listening, and they saw Hitler as the solution.
Hitler was a masterful opportunist and was able to make maximum political capital out of this crisis.
The Nazi Party started experiencing a meteoric rise in popularity. In the elections before the Wall Street crash, they only got 2.6% of the vote. But by 1932, there had been an astonishing turnaround. They had become the largest party in the country, winning more than 1/3 of the votes cast. And in early 1933, President Hindenburg made Hitler Chancellor. The Nazi faithful held a torch parade to celebrate. But this still wasn't enough for Hitler. He wanted absolute power. On the 2nd of August 1934, the death of President Hindenburg gave Hitler his chance to take the top spot. Back when Hitler was made Chancellor, there was only one person in Germany superior to him: President Hindenburg. He was the head of state and supreme commander of the army, the only one who could keep the Chancellor in check. But by the summer of 1934, Hindenburg was on his deathbed, and Hitler's prize was finally within his grasp. But he had to make sure there wasn't going to be a new president afterwards.
So just a few days before Hindenburg dies, he draws up this idea, a law in which if Hindenburg dies, Hitler can amalgamate the posts of Chancellor and President and become what is an all-powerful leader called the Führer.
The day after the new law was signed, President Hindenburg died. Within 2 hours, Hitler was made the Führer, the leader. On the same day, the whole army swore an oath of allegiance to him, personally.
Diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer, Adolf Hitler,
The army owes allegiance to what it thinks is the German state, not to an individual. And here is an individual trying to take over the German state. He is saying that he amalgamates the whole German state in his being. Here is the moment when we can talk of a one-party, personal dictatorship.
Hitler now had complete power over Germany. But for a narcissist with a vision, this still wasn't enough. He now set his sights on expansion and creating a German empire. On the 12th of March 1938, Hitler invaded Austria. It was his first major step in his desire for world domination. Hitler's grand plan was to bring all ethnic Germans together under the umbrella of one huge empire, including Austria. His idea was to destabilize the country from within.
Nazi party members in Austria had been creating huge amounts of disruption, explosions, violence, all kinds of mayhem. He was able to argue that the Austrian dictator at the time was not controlling events that German speakers in Austria were suffering.
After months of civil disorder, the plan worked.
The government was overthrown and Hitler was invited to occupy Austria. It wasn't so much an invasion, if you like, as a lap of honour.
Hitler couldn't be certain how the Austrian population would react. If badly, it would put an end to any further plans for expansion. This time, his self-belief was well-founded, as the only resistance the army met was pushing through the sheer weight of the crowds. Hitler followed behind and crossed over the River Inn and into Austrian Braunau, the town where he was born.
Hitler obviously wanted to symbolize by his driving into Braunau the fact that he, as originally an Austrian who became head of Germany, symbolized in one person this merger of the two countries.
After passing through Braunau, his motorcade carried on to Linz, where he had gone to school, and where he dreamt of being an artist decades earlier. That evening, he delivered a speech. After seeing the reaction of the crowds, he made a remarkable decision: that Austria wouldn't stay as a separate country within the German Empire, but that it would become part of Germany itself.
Hitler often thought on his feet, and he changed his views as circumstances dictated, and I think the very evident popularity of the Anschluss convinced him that this is the right way to go.
Hitler carried on his triumphant tour to Vienna.
Surely thoughts went back to that moment when he was down and out, without a penny in his pocket, with no hope really of what he was going to be in the future. And here he was now, adulated by the entire population of Vienna.
His returning in such a fashion cancelled out what had gone before. It didn't matter anymore. And he was saying, look at me, here I am, I've arrived. Anything that's gone before is irrelevant or didn't exist.
The end of his journey was here, the Habsburg Palace, where a crowd of more than 200,000 people had assembled.
It's such an amazing turnaround from a down and out to the leader of what is now the most powerful country in the whole of Europe.
He returns as the whole German people. He's the voice of the German people. He's no longer an individual.
Hitler must have felt invincible. He was godlike. And that there were no limits to what he could achieve. The only boundaries that exist are what exist in his own mind.
If there's one day that shook Hitler, this was that day. This was probably the moment when he thought, hey, I can't do any wrong here. Maybe I can take over the world.